Life can be a real adventure. Hot, fast,
Slow or sad.
maybe sometimes even filled with ups and downs.
But according to psychiatrists, any part of life can be labeled a mental illness.
Really? Like what?
Let's say you're upset after a bad breakup. Well, that could be labeled depression,
What if you're nervous before speaking in public?
anxiety disorder,
Or being really talkative and super active?
manic.
That sounds a little crazy.
It does.
But how much does this really happen?
Let's go ask.
How many people do you know that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Diagnosed with a mental, God, off the top of my head, maybe one person that I know who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder.
Probably just one.
So, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe in the 3 or 4 range.
4 or 5, maybe 5.
6 people in the household.
6, 7.
10.
A dozen or so.
About 20.
How about 30?
It would definitely be in the hundreds for sure.
The total number of people that I know in my lifetime has been diagnosed with a mental disorder probably fall around the range of 100 to 150, and I'm 23 years old.
Wow. But where are these disorders all coming from?
From Psychiatry's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's 943 pages long and covers everything from depression and anxiety to stuttering, cigarette addiction, fear of spiders, nightmares, problems with math, and even disorder of infancy. All reinterpreted and many falsely labeled as a brain disease.
But people do have serious problems in life.
Absolutely. But psychiatrists reduce them down to something wrong with your brain.
So let me get this straight. Psychiatrists have a book of life problems reinterpreted as mental disorders?
That's right.
Wow. Then it must be backed up by a lot of science.
You'd think so, but it isn't. Psychiatrists at one of their recent conventions admitted to it. Listen to this.
DSM is made up by committees of men who have political opinion, and women too, who have biases and political opinions. And so there isn't nearly as much science in DSM as there ought to be.
Like in the previous one, people had a meeting in the bathroom and they decided that something should be in there, and then they would go and propose it to the whole committee.
You have this kind of lumping together of several observations, and when you get enough of them in one tent, you got a diagnosis.
DSM system is not the real system of the diagnosis.
A lot of the disorders that are in there haven't necessarily been rigorously validated.
It's just the best tool that we have available, but it is not perfect.
It's so useless that if you give me a patient and the DSM, I'll make at least 20 diagnoses on the same patient.
You have to take it with a grain of salt anyway.
It's actually getting more and more complicated.
We're left with diagnosing things on the basis of checklists and questionnaires, which leaves us sort of out of, as you said, the rest of medicine because we don't have a biological test.
Amazing.
The lack of science in the DSM is actually an open secret. Here's what some professionals have to say about it.
The DSM is a sham. It's been described as a house of cards. Why? Because the diagnoses are theoretical. They're not based on scientific measurements.
It's sort of a shaky level built on another shaky level, built on another shaky level.
It is flimsy and that it is easily collapsible under the scrutiny of critical thinking.
If you just pull one little fragment of the reasoning aside and question it thoroughly, you'll find it doesn't stand up, and then that means that the whole organism collapses because you've got some wrong premises in there somewhere. In fact, they're all over the place.
It is indeed a house of cards because it's predicated on not a solid structure. It is built to create an apparently legitimate edifice, which results in a diagnosis. But any serious inquiry will show it to be illegitimate.
Moneymakers here, I tell you. With schizophrenia,
So, if the DSM is not based on science, what is it based on?
Well, it started out as a simple desire for psychiatry and psychology to be accepted by mainstream medicine.
We psychologists have always desperately wanted to be accepted as a real science, as a true science. Now, what the early psychologists did was they looked around and they saw what other scientists were doing, and they decided to emulate them.
Modern approaches to classifying psychiatric disorders dates from the 19th century. Nearly all the clinical concepts we have today originate from that time. Probably the most important of all was a chap called Emil Kraepelin, who worked first of all in Heidelberg and then in Munich.
Never heard of him.
Emil Kraepelin is known as the father of psychiatric classification. He was the first person to classify what he thought were biological illnesses in the brain. There was dementia praecox, which is now called schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, and paranoid psychosis, all concepts that still exist in the DSM today.
That's it? 3 disorders?
Yes, only 3, but Kraepelin's system soon became very popular. Listen to this.
Kraepelin's system caught on very quickly, not only in the German-speaking world, but also in the English-speaking world, in the United States and Britain. It caught on because up to that point, nobody had an agreed way of talking about patients.
So in the early 1950s, there was compiled Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, there are very few statistics in the book. Disorder is used essentially as a euphemism for illness. This is a book which catalogues mental illnesses for which no medical sign has ever been discovered.
This primitive pamphlet was 130 pages long and listed 112 mental disorders, small compared to the current DSM, but much bigger than anything Kraepelin envisioned.
Why so many?
Because by defining more and more of life as abnormal, psychiatrists could get their hands on a huge amount of government money.
Defining life? What do you mean?
Well, things like holding your breath, biting your nails, thumb-sucking, sleepwalking, poor efficiency, even homosexuality.
That's ridiculous. They added all those just to have people to treat?
And more. Then the second version, DSM-2, came along in 1968 and expanded to 178 disorders, again to grab even more government insurance money. To do this internationally, the DSM-2 was specifically written to align with the International Classification of Disease, the ICD, a book extensively used in Europe and around the world that, apart from psychiatric diagnoses, lists real medical diseases.
So that's how psychiatric disorders got accepted by mainstream medicine.
It was a start, but the DSM-2 was still not scientific, as it was heavily influenced not by actual clinical testing, but by the theories of Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud.
Then there must have been a lot of neuroses in that book, right?
Yep. But there was absolutely no knowledge of what caused them, nor did they even look for a cause.
Inclusion of a disorder in the classification does not require that there be knowledge about its etiology. So in other words, to make a diagnosis, you really don't need to bother with cause and effect. You don't need to know what causes the condition.
Wait a minute. If the DSM doesn't tell you what causes its mental disorders, how does psychiatrists discover them in the first place?
The answer may surprise you.
New diseases are being invented all the time, and I want to emphasize the word invented, because when it comes to psychiatry, mental illnesses are not discovered, they're invented.
The way the system works in terms of diagnosis is that every few years, a group of psychiatrists and psychologists sit around in a room and vote on new diagnoses.
This is science? I can't believe it.
Don't worry, you're not alone.
The diseases are voted on? What do you mean?
Did you say, are they voted into existence?
Or voted?
As in created.
Oh, man.
I think that's kind of ridiculous. It's crazy that you would vote. I definitely don't agree.
I don't agree with it at all.
Mental disorders should be based on scientific research.
I have been led to believe that it's all based on medicine and science.
So I'm kind of shocked to find that out.
Me too.
There's more. Not only are mental disorders voted into the DSM, but now and then they are also voted out. Take, for example, homosexuality, listed in DSMs 1 and 2 as a mental illness. This is how the editor-in-chief of the DSM-3, Robert Spitzer, explained it.
I came up with a definition in 1973 that made it possible to argue that homosexuality was not a mental disorder.
On a vote, essentially, at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, it was removed.
Now, did they discover that homosexuality was not a disease through scientific processes? No. It was included for political reasons, and it was removed for political reasons.
And the end result is a vote. It's a supposed democracy. So to call it science is a complete fabrication.
So the DSM is actually political, not scientific.
Right.
I thought psychiatrists wanted to be seen as doctors.
You're right. That's why they had to make their manual look much more scientific.
Which it wasn't. So what did they do then?
Well, they decided the DSM's next edition was going to be completely different. It was a decision that would change psychiatry forever.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living now essentially had to be redefined. And they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So hence we have DSM-3, which is the third edition, which was published in 1980.
Under Spitzer, psychiatrists editing the DSM-3 threw out Freudian psychology and decreed that from now on, psychiatry's diagnoses were purely biological.
So they finally became scientific.
No, actually, not at all. In fact, the political bickering over what disorders to put in and what to leave out of the DSM-3 was even more ridiculous. Here's what one psychiatrist had to say about it.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
And this is what another member of the DSM decision-making panel said.
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Sounds like they had a diagnostic manual that looked more scientific but had no more science in it than before.
Meanwhile, the number of mental disorders in the DSM-3 had ballooned to 259. But to sell the idea that psychiatry was a true medical science, they had to spin it with a really impressive scientific-sounding theory.
But with DSM-3 from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalisation of psychiatry, and the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
Whoa, chemical what?